This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
As a narrator, it has been a privilege to bring Nehru's words to life. First published in 1936 as Toward Freedom, the autobiography of Jawaharlal Nehru. This autobiography captures the journey of a statesman, a freedom fighter, and an intellectual. It provides a deep insight into Nehru's thoughts, his experiences during India's freedom struggle, and his reflections on life and politics. The book came out immediately after his wife's death, and the dedication page says, "To Kamala, who is no more." And now, let us begin with the preface to the first edition.
Nehru writes,
"This book was written entirely in prison, except for the postscript and certain minor changes, from June 1934 to February 1935. The primary object in writing these pages was to occupy myself with a definite task, so necessary in the long solitudes of jail life, as well as to review past events in India, with which I had been connected, to enable myself to think clearly about them. I began the task in a mood of self-questioning, and to a large extent this persisted throughout. I was not writing deliberately for an audience, but if I thought of an audience, it was one of my own countrymen and countrywomen. For foreign readers I would have probably written differently, or with a different emphasis, stressing certain aspects which have been slurred over in the narrative, and passing over lightly certain other aspects which I have treated at some length. Many of these latter aspects may not interest the non-Indian reader, and he may consider them unimportant or too obvious for discussion or debate. But I felt that in the India of today they had a certain importance. A number of references to our internal politics and personalities may also be of little interest to the outsider. The reader will, I hope, remember that the book was written during a particularly distressful period of my existence. It bears obvious traces of this. If the writing had been done under more normal conditions, it would have been different and perhaps occasionally more restrained. Yet I have decided to leave it as it is, for it may have some interest for others in so far as it represents what I felt at the time of writing. My attempt was to trace as far as I could my own mental development and not to write a survey of recent Indian history. The fact that this account resembles superficially such a survey is apt to mislead the reader and lead him to attach a wider importance to it than it deserves. I must warn him, therefore, that this account is wholly one-sided and inevitably egotistical. Many important happenings have been completely ignored, and many important persons who shaped events have hardly been mentioned. In a real survey of past events, this would have been inexcusable, but a personal account can claim this indulgence. Those who want to make a proper study of our recent past will have to go to other sources. It may be, however, that this and other personal narratives will help them to fill the gaps and to provide a background for the study of hard fact. I have discussed frankly some of my colleagues with whom I have been privileged to work for many years and for whom I have the greatest regard and affection. I have also criticized groups and individuals, sometimes perhaps rather severely. The criticism does not take away from my respect for many of them, but I have felt that those who meddle in public affairs must be frank with each other and with the public they claim to serve. A superficial courtesy and an avoidance of embarrassing and sometimes distressing questions do not help in bringing about a true understanding of each other or of the problems that face us. Real cooperation must be based on an appreciation of differences as well as common points and a facing of facts, however inconvenient they might be. I trust, however, that nothing that I have written bears a trace of malice or ill will against any individual. I have purposely avoided discussing the issues in India today, except vaguely and indirectly. I was not in a position to go into them with any thoroughness in prison, or even to decide in my own mind what should be done. Even after my release, I did not think it worthwhile to add anything on this subject. It did not seem to fit in with what I had already written. And so, this autobiographical narrative remains a sketchy, personal, and incomplete account of the past, verging on the present, but cautiously avoiding contact with it.
Jawaharlal Nehru.
Badenweiler, 2nd January 1936. Chapter 1. Descent from Kashmir. It is a hard and nice subject for a man to write of himself. It grates his own heart to say anything of disparagement, and the reader's ears to hear anything of praise for him. Abraham Cowley. An only son of prosperous parents is apt to be spoilt, especially so in India. And when that son happens to have been an only child for the first 11 years of his existence, there is little hope for him to escape this spoiling. My two sisters are very much younger than I am, and between each two of us there is a long stretch of years. And so I grew up and spent my early years as a somewhat lonely child, with no companions of my age. I did not even have the companionship of children at school, for I was not sent to any kindergarten or primary school. Governesses or private tutors were supposed to be in charge of my education. Our house itself was far from being a lonely place, for it sheltered a large family of cousins and near relations after the manner of Hindu families. But all my cousins were much older than I was, and were students at the high school or the university, and considered me far too young for their work or their play. And so in the midst of that big family I felt rather lonely, and was left a great deal to my own fancies and solitary games. We were Kashmiris. Over 200 years ago, early in the 18th century, our ancestor came down from that mountain valley to seek fame and fortune in the rich plains below. Those were the days of the decline of the Mughal Empire,
After the death of Aurangzeb, and Farrukhsiyar was the emperor. Raj Kaul
was the name of that ancestor of ours, and he had gained eminence as a Sanskrit and Persian scholar in Kashmir. He attracted the notice of Farrukhsiyar during the latter's visit to Kashmir, and, probably at the emperor's instance, the family migrated to Delhi, the imperial capital, about the year 1716.
A Jagir with a house situated on the banks of a canal had been granted to
Raj Kaul, and, from the fact of this residence, Nehru,
from Nahar,
a canal, came to be attached to his name. Kaul had been the family name. This changed to Kaul Nehru, and, in later years, Kaul dropped out, and we became simply Nehrus. The family experienced many vicissitudes of fortune during the unsettled times that followed, and the Jagir dwindled and vanished away. My great-grandfather, Lakshmi Narayan Nehru, became the first vakil of the Sarkar Company at the shadow court of the Emperor of Delhi. My grandfather,
Gangadhar Nehru,
was Kotwal of Delhi for some time before the Great Revolt of 1857. He died at the early age of 34 in 1861. The revolt of 1857 put an end to our family's connection with Delhi, and all our old family papers and documents were destroyed in the course of it. The family, having lost nearly all it possessed, joined the numerous fugitives who were leaving the old imperial city and went to Agra. My father was not born then, but my two uncles were already young men and possessed some knowledge of English. This knowledge saved the younger of the two uncles, as well as some other members of the family, from a sudden and ignominious end. He was journeying from Delhi with some family members, among whom was his young sister, a little girl who was very fair, as some Kashmiri children are. Some English soldiers met them on the way, and they suspected this little aunt of mine to be an English girl, and accused my uncle of kidnapping her. From an accusation to summary justice and punishment was usually a matter of minutes in those days, and my uncle and others of the family might well have found themselves hanging on the nearest tree. Fortunately for them, my uncle's knowledge of English delayed matters a little, and then someone who knew him passed that way and rescued him and the others. For some years the family lived in Agra, and it was in Agra on the 6th of May 1861 that my father was born. Footnote: a curious and interesting coincidence. The poet Rabindranath Tagore was also born on this very day, month and year. End of footnote. But my father was a posthumous child, as my grandfather had died 3 months earlier. In a little painting that we have of my grandfather, he wears the Mughal court dress with a curved sword in his hand, and might well be taken for a Mughal nobleman, although his features are distinctly Kashmiri. The burden of the family then fell on my two uncles, who were very much older than my father. The elder uncle, Bansidhar Nehru, soon after entered the judicial department of the British government, and being appointed successively to various places, was partly cut off from the rest of the family. The younger uncle,
Nandlal Nehru,
entered the service of an Indian state and was Diwan of Khetri state in Rajputana for 10 years. Later he studied law and settled down as a practicing lawyer in Agra. My father lived with him and grew up under his sheltering care. The two were greatly attached to each other, and their relation with each other was a strange mixture of the brotherly and the paternal and filial. My father, being the last comer, was of course my grandmother's favorite son, and she was an old lady with a tremendous will of her own, who was not accustomed to be ignored. It is now nearly half a century since her death, but she is still remembered amongst old Kashmiri ladies as a most dominating old woman, and quite a terror if her will was flouted. My uncle attached himself to the newly established High Court, and when this court moved to Allahabad from Agra, the family moved with it. Since then, Allahabad has been our home, and it was there, many years later, that I was born. My uncle gradually developed an extensive practice and became one of the leaders of the High Court bar. Meanwhile, my father was going through school and college in Kanpur and Allahabad. His early education was confined entirely to Persian and Arabic, and he only began learning English in his early teens. But at that age he was considered to be a good Persian scholar and knew some Arabic also, and because of this knowledge was treated with respect by much older people. But in spite of this early precocity, his school and college career was chiefly notable for his numerous pranks and escapades. He was very far from being model pupil, and took more interest in games and novel adventures than in study. He was looked upon as one of the leaders of the rowdy element in college. He was attracted to Western dress and other Western ways at a time when it was uncommon for Indians to take to them, except in big cities like Calcutta and Bombay. Though he was a little wild in his behavior, his English professors were fond of him and often got him out of a scrape. They liked his spirit, and he was intelligent, and with an occasional spurt he managed to do fairly well even in class. In later years, long afterwards, he used to talk to us of one of these professors, Mr. Harrison, the principal of the Muir Central College at Allahabad, with affection, and had carefully preserved a letter of his dating from the old student days. He got through his various university examinations without any special distinction, and then he appeared for his final, the B.A. He had not taken the trouble to work much for it, and he was greatly dissatisfied with the way he had done the first paper. Not expecting to pass the examination, as he thought he had spoiled the first paper, he decided to boycott the rest of the examination, and he spent his time instead at the Taj Mahal. The university examinations were held then at Agra. Subsequently, his professor sent for him and was very angry with him, for he said that he, my father, had done the first paper fairly well, and he had been a fool for not appearing for the other papers. Anyhow, this ended my father's university career. He never graduated. He was keen on getting on in life and establishing himself in a profession. Naturally, he looked to the law, as that was the only profession then, in India, which offered any opening for talent and prizes for the successful. He also had his brother's example before him. He appeared for the High Court Vakil's examination, and not only passed it, but topped the list and got a gold medal for it. He had found subject after his own heart, or rather, he was intent on success in the profession of his choice. He started practice in the district courts of Kanpur, and being eager to succeed, worked hard at it and soon got on well. But his love for games and other amusements and diversions continued and still took up part of his time. In particular, he was keen on wrestling and dangals. Kanpur was famous for these public wrestling matches in those days. After serving his apprenticeship for 3 years at Kanpur, father moved to Allahabad to work in the High Court. Not long after this, his brother, Pandit Nandlal, suddenly died. That was a terrible blow for my father. It was a personal loss of a dearly loved brother who had almost been a father to him, and the removal of the head and principal earning member of the family. Henceforward, the burden of carrying on a large family mainly fell on his young shoulders. He plunged into his work, bent on success, and for many months cut himself off from everything else. Nearly all of my uncle's briefs came to him, and as he happened to do well in them, the professional success that he so ardently desired soon came his way and brought him both additional work and money. At an early age, he had established himself as a successful lawyer, and he paid the price for this by becoming more and more a slave to his jealous mistress, the law. He had no time for any other activity, public or private, and even his vacations and holidays were devoted to his legal practice. The National Congress was just then attracting the attention of the English-knowing middle classes, and he visited some of its early sessions and gave it a theoretical allegiance. But in those days he took no great interest in its work. He was too busy with his profession. Besides, he felt unsure of his ground in politics and public affairs. He had paid no great attention to these subjects till then, and knew little about them. He had no wish to join any movement or organization where he would have to play second fiddle. The aggressive spirit of his childhood and early youth had been outwardly curbed, but it had taken a new form, a new will to power. Directed to his profession, it brought success, and increased his pride and self-reliance. He loved a fight, a struggle against odds, and yet, curiously, in those days he avoided the political field. It is true that there was little of fight then in the politics of the National Congress. However, the ground was unfamiliar, and his mind was full of the hard work that his profession involved. He had taken firm grip of the ladder of success, and rung by rung he mounted higher, not by anyone's favor, as he felt, not by any service of another, but by his own will and intellect. He was, of course, a nationalist in a vague sense of the word, but he admired Englishmen and their ways. He had a feeling that his own countrymen had fallen low and almost deserved what they had got. And there was just a trace of contempt in his mind for the politicians who talked and talked without doing anything, though he had no idea at all as to what else they could do. Also there was the thought, born in the pride of his own success, that many, certainly not all, of those who took to politics had been failures in life. An ever-increasing income brought many changes in our ways of living, for an increasing income meant increasing expenditure. The idea of hoarding money seemed to my father a slight on his own capacity to earn whenever he liked and as much as he desired. Full of the spirit of play and fond of good living every way, he found no difficulty in spending what he earned. And gradually our ways became more and more westernized. Such was our home in the early days of my childhood. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. Childhood. My childhood was thus a sheltered and uneventful one. I listened to the grown-up talk of my cousins without always understanding all of it. Often this talk related to the overbearing character and insulting manners of the English people as well as Eurasians towards Indians, and how it was the duty of every Indian to stand up to this and not to tolerate it. Instances of conflicts between the rulers and the ruled were common and were fully discussed. It was a notorious fact that whenever an Englishman killed an Indian, he was acquitted by a jury of his own countrymen. In railway trains, compartments were reserved for Europeans, and however crowded the train might be, and they used to be terribly crowded, no Indian was allowed to travel in them, even though they were empty. Even an unreserved compartment would be taken possession of by an Englishman, and he would not allow any Indian to enter it. Benches and chairs were also reserved for Europeans in public parks and other places. I was filled with resentment against the alien rulers of my country who misbehaved in this manner, and whenever an Indian hit back, I was glad. Not infrequently, one of my cousins or one of their friends became personally involved in these individual encounters, and then, of course, we all got very excited over it. One of the cousins was the strong man of the family, and he loved to pick a quarrel with an Englishman, or more frequently with Eurasians, who, perhaps to show off their oneness with the ruling race, were often even more offensive than the English official or merchant. Such quarrels took place especially during railway journeys. Much as I began to resent the presence and behavior of the alien rulers, I had no feeling whatever, so far as I can remember, against individual Englishmen. I had had English governesses, and occasionally I saw English friends of my father's visiting him. In my heart, I rather admired the English. In the evenings usually many friends came to visit father, and he would relax after the tension of the day, and the house would resound with his tremendous laughter. His laugh became famous in Allahabad. Sometimes I would peep at him and his friends from behind a curtain trying to make out what these great big people said to each other. If I was caught in the act I would be dragged out and, rather frightened, made to sit for a while on father's knee. Once I saw him drinking claret or some other red wine. Whiskey I knew. I had often seen him and his friends drink it. But the new red stuff filled me with horror, and I rushed to my mother to tell her that father was drinking blood. I admired father tremendously. He seemed to me the embodiment of strength and courage and cleverness, far above all the other men I saw, and I treasured the hope that when I grew up I would be rather like him. But much as I admired him and loved him, I feared him also. I had seen him losing his temper at servants and others, and he seemed to me terrible then, and I shivered with fright, mixed sometimes with resentment, at the treatment of a servant. His temper was indeed an awful thing, and even in after years I do not think I ever came across anything to match it in its own line. But fortunately he had a strong sense of humour also, and an iron will, and he could control himself as a rule. As he grew older this power of control grew, and it was very rare for him to indulge in anything like his old temper. One of my earliest recollections is of this temper, for I was the victim of it. I must have been about 5 or 6 then. I noticed one day 2 fountain pens on his office table, and I looked at them with greed. I argued with myself that father could not require both at the same time, and so I helped myself to one of them. Later I found that a mighty search was being made for the lost pen, and I grew frightened at what I had done, but I did not confess. The pen was discovered, and my guilt proclaimed to the world. Father was very angry, and he gave me a tremendous thrashing. Almost blind with pain and mortification at my disgrace, I rushed to mother, and for several days various creams and ointments were applied to my aching and quivering little body. I do not remember bearing any ill will towards my father because of this punishment. I think I must have felt that it was a just punishment, though perhaps overdone. But though my admiration and affection for him remained as strong as ever, fear formed a part of them. Not so with my mother. I had no fear of her, for I knew that she would condone everything I did, and because of her excessive and indiscriminating love for me, I tried to dominate over her a little. I saw much more of her than I did of father, and she seemed nearer to me, and I would confide in her when I would not dream of doing so to father. She was petite and short of stature, and soon I was almost as tall as she was, and felt more of an equal with her. I admired her beauty, and loved her amazingly small and beautiful hands and feet. She belonged to a fresher stock from Kashmir, and her people had only left the homeland 2 generations back. Another of my early confidants was a munshi of my father's, Munshi Mubarak Ali. He came from a well-to-do family of Badaयूं. The revolt of 1857 had ruined the family, and the English troops had partly exterminated it. This affliction had made him gentle and forbearing with everybody, especially with children, and for me he was a sure haven of refuge whenever I was unhappy or in trouble. With his fine grey beard, he seemed to my young eyes very ancient and full of old-time lore, and I used to snuggle up to him and listen, wide-eyed, by the hour to his innumerable stories, old tales from the Arabian Nights or other sources, or accounts of the happenings in 1857 and 1858. It was many years later, when I was grown up, that Munshiji died, and the memory of him still remains with me as a dear and precious possession. There were other stories also that I listened to, stories from the old Hindu mythology, from the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, that my mother and aunt used to tell us. My aunt, the widow of Pandit Nandlal, was learned in the old Indian books and had an inexhaustible supply of these tales, and my knowledge of Indian mythology and folklore became quite considerable. Of religion I had very hazy notions. It seemed to be a woman's affair. Father and my older cousins treated the question humorously and refused to take it seriously. The women of the family indulged in various ceremonies and pujas from time to time, and I rather enjoyed them, though I tried to imitate to some extent the casual attitude of the grown-up men of the family. Sometimes I accompanied my mother or aunt to the Ganges for a dip. Sometimes we visited temples in Allahabad itself, or in Benares or elsewhere, or went to see a sannyasi reputed to be very holy. But all this left little impression on my mind. Then there were the great festival days, the Holi, when all over the city there was a spirit of revelry and we could squirt water at each other, the Diwali, the festival of light, when all the houses were lit up with thousands of dim lights in earthen cups,
the Janmashtami,
to celebrate the birth in prison of Krishna at the midnight hour. But it was very difficult for us to keep awake till then. The Dasera and Ramlila, when tableaux and processions reenacted the old story of Ramchandra and his conquest of Lanka, and vast crowds assembled to see them. All the children also went to see the Mohuram processions with their silken alams and their sorrowful celebration of the tragic story of Hassan and Hussein in distant Arabia. And on the 2 Eid days, Munshiji would dress up in his best attire and go to the big mosque for prayers, and I would go to his house and consume sweet vermicelli and other dainties. And then there were the smaller festivals, of which there are many in the Hindu calendar,
Raksha Bandhan, Bhaiya Dooj, etc.
Amongst us and the other Kashmiris, there were also some special celebrations which were not observed by most of the other Hindus. Chief of these was the Nowroz, the New Year's Day according to the Samvat calendar. This was always a special day for us when all of us wore new clothes, and the young people of the house got small sums of money as tips. But more than all these festivals, I was interested in one annual event in which I played the central part, the celebration of the anniversary of my birth. This was a day of great excitement for me. Early in the morning I was weighed in a huge balance against some bagfuls of wheat and other articles which were then distributed to the poor, and then I arrayed myself in new clothes and received presents, and later in the day there was a party. I felt the hero of the occasion. My chief grievance was that my birthday came so rarely. Indeed, I tried to start an agitation for more frequent birthdays. I did not realize then that a time would come when birthdays would become unpleasant reminders of advancing age. Sometimes the whole family journeyed to a distant town to attend a marriage, either of a cousin of mine or of some more distant relation or friend. Those were exciting journeys for us, children, for all rules were relaxed during these marriage festivities, and we had the free run of the place. Numerous families usually lived crowded together
in the Shadi Khana,
the marriage house, where the party stayed, and there were many boys and girls and children. On these occasions I could not complain of loneliness, and we had our hearts full of play and mischief, with an occasional scolding from our elders. Indian marriages, both among the rich and the poor, have had their full share of condemnation as wasteful and extravagant display. They deserve all this. Even apart from the waste, it is most painful to see the vulgar display which has no artistic or aesthetic value of any kind. Needless to say, there are exceptions. For all this, the really guilty people are the middle classes. The poor are also extravagant, even at the cost of burdensome debts. But it is the height of absurdity to say, as some people do, that their poverty is due to their social customs. It is often forgotten that the life of the poor is terribly dull and monotonous, and an occasional marriage celebration, bringing with it some feasting and singing, comes to them as an oasis in a desert of soulless toil, a refuge from domesticity and the prosaic business of life. Who would be cruel enough to deny this consolation to them, who have such few occasions for laughter? Stop waste by all means, lessen the extravagance, big and foolish words to use for the little show that the poor put up in their poverty. But do not make their life more drab and cheerless than it is. So also for the middle classes. Waste and extravagance apart, these marriages are big social reunions where distant relations and old friends meet after long intervals. India is a big country, and it is not easy for friends to meet, and for many to meet together at the same time still more difficult. Hence the popularity of the marriage celebrations. The only rival to them, and it has already excelled them in many ways even as a social reunion, is the political gathering, the various conferences, or the Congress. Kashmiris have had one advantage over many others in India, especially in the north. They have never had any parda or seclusion of women among themselves. Finding this custom prevailing in the Indian plains, when they came down, they adopted it, but only partly, and in so far as their relations with others and non-Kashmiris were concerned. That was considered then in northern India, where most of the Kashmiris stayed, an inevitable sign of social status. But among themselves, they stuck to the free social life of men and women, and every Kashmiri had the free entree into any Kashmiri house. In Kashmiri feasts and ceremonies, men and women met together and sat together, though often the women would sit in one bunch. Boys and girls used to meet on a more or less equal footing. They did not, of course, have the freedom of the modern West, so past my early years. Sometimes, as was inevitable in a large family, there were family squabbles. When these happened to assume unusual proportions, they reached my father's ears, and he was angry, and seemed to think that all such happenings were due to the folly of women. I did not understand what exactly had happened, but I saw that something was very wrong, as people seemed to speak in a peculiarly disagreeable way, or to avoid each other. I felt very unhappy. Father's intervention, when it took place, shook us all up. One little incident of those early days stands out in my memory. I must have been about 7 or 8 then. I used to go out every day for a ride, accompanied by a sowar from a cavalry unit then stationed in Allahabad. One evening I had a fall, and my pony, a pretty animal, partly Arab, returned home without me. Father was giving a tennis party. There was great consternation, and all the members of the party, headed by father, formed a procession in all kinds of vehicles, and set out in search of me. They met me on the way, and I was treated as if I had performed some heroic deed. End of chapter 2.